I never thought my life would unravel in whispers. It was a cold night, the kind where the silence feels thicker, heavier, like the air itself is conspiring against you. I had been working late, pushing through another mindless deadline, and as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the soft glow of the balcony light. It was past midnight, and there she was, my wife, Amelia, leaning against the railing with a cigarette in hand. That alone was strange. She rarely smoked. I was about to call out to her when I heard it, the low murmur of her voice. She was on the phone, her words carried on the crisp breeze like little daggers. I should have gone inside, closed the door, and respected her privacy, but something in her tone froze me in place. A laugh, sharp and cruel, escaped her lips. "I mean, seriously, what does he even do?" she said, mockery dripping from her words. "It's like living with a boring roommate. He doesn't inspire me. Hell, he doesn't even challenge me. All he does is exist." I felt the ground beneath me tilt. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the venom spilling from her mouth. Who was she talking to? My chest tightened as I leaned further into the shadows, my heart pounding louder with every passing second. "No, he has no clue," she continued, her voice tinged with glee. "I'm practically a saint for staying this long. You're the only thing keeping me sane, babe." The word babe hit me like a slap across the face. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from crying out. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. She wasn't just cheating. She was laughing about me. About us. About the life we had built together. I don't know how long I stood there, hidden in the dark, before the call ended. She stubbed out her cigarette, muttered something under her breath, and went inside. For a moment, I just stared at the orange ember fading into the night. That ember was all I could feel, a tiny, burning rage slowly consuming the numbness. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I stayed outside, gulping in the cold air like it could drown the anger rising in my chest. My hands shook, not just from the chill, but from the realization that my world had just cracked open, spilling secrets I wasn't prepared to face. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee untouched as Amelia breezed in, her phone clutched in her hand. She looked every bit the woman I had fallen in love with, poised, radiant, and completely at ease. It made me sick. "Morning," she chirped, barely glancing at me as she flipped through her messages. I studied her, trying to find a hint of remorse, a crack in the facade, but there was nothing. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Who were you talking to last night?" My voice was calm, quieter than I expected. That seemed to catch her attention. She froze, her fingers hovering over the phone screen, before recovering with a casual laugh. "What are you talking about?" "On the balcony. I heard you." She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into that dismissive smirk I was beginning to despise. "I was just catching up with a friend." "Why? Is that a crime now?" The lie rolled off her tongue, so smoothly it made my stomach churn. "A friend?" I repeated, my grip tightening around the mug. "You were mocking me, laughing about me, about our marriage." Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before she crossed her arms defensively. "Oh, for God's sake, don't be so dramatic. It was just girl talk. We all need to vent sometimes. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Girl talk?" I scoffed. "You called him babe. You said I don't inspire you, that I'm just existing. Who is he, Amelia?" She rolled her eyes, her irritation bubbling to the surface. "You're unbelievable. You know that? I spend years supporting you, putting up with your endless routines, your boring job, and the one time I let off some steam, you act like I've committed a crime." "Have you?" I shot back, the words sharp and cutting. "Have you committed a crime, Amelia? Because lying to my face, treating me like I'm nothing, feels criminal." Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it again. But instead, she pivoted, her voice rising in hysteria. "You want to know why I'm so unhappy? It's because you're insufferable, Mark. You sit there, day after day, acting like you're this perfect husband, but you're not. You've let this marriage rot while you drown yourself in work and pretend everything's fine. Her words cut deeper than I expected. I wanted to defend myself, to remind her of the sacrifices I'd made, the times I'd tried to connect with her only to be met with her indifference. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew this wasn't about me. "Don't turn this around," I said, my voice low and steady. "You're the one who stepped out, not me. You're the one who chose to betray what we had." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Oh, get over yourself. People cheat all the time, Mark. Maybe if you'd been half the man I needed, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." The air seemed to leave the room. Her cruelty was breathtaking, a final nail in the coffin of whatever love I had left for her. I pushed back my chair and stood, towering over her. "I hope he was worth it," I said quietly, turning toward the door. "Where are you going?" she called after me, her tone more mocking than concerned. I didn't answer. I grabbed my keys and left, the sound of the door slamming behind me echoing in my ears. As I drove, I realized I wasn't running away. I was planning my escape. I didn't go far that day, just to a nearby park where I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel and staring out at nothing. My mind was a blur, jumping between moments in our marriage. The happy ones, the arguments, the silences that grew like cracks in a foundation. I tried to pinpoint when it had started to fall apart, but the truth was it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came next. The first step was to gather evidence. I wasn't going to let her turn this on me, twist the narrative like she always did. If I was going to walk away, I needed to make sure she couldn't drag me through the mud on her way down. I called an old friend, Tim, a lawyer who had helped me with some work contracts in the past. "Mark," he said, surprised. "What's going on?" "I need a divorce lawyer," I said, cutting to the chase. There was a long pause. "Shit. Okay. Do you want to tell me what happened?" I hesitated. The words felt heavy, like speaking them aloud would make it all too real. "She's cheating," I said finally. "I need to know how to protect myself." Tim didn't ask for details. Instead, he outlined the basics, what I'd need to document, how to approach the situation calmly, and what steps to take to ensure a clean break. It was clinical, almost cold, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. When I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't going to let her hysteria, her venom, or her lies pull me into the chaos she thrived on. I would handle this on my terms. I went home that evening, my resolve hardened. Amelia was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. She barely glanced up when I walked in. "Where'd you run off to?" she asked, her tone casual, almost bored. "Work," I lied. "I needed to clear my head." She shrugged and went back to her phone, and I realized something that should have been obvious all along. She didn't care. Not about me, not about us. Whatever we had once shared was long gone, and I was the only one still holding on. Over the next few days, I played my part. I didn't confront her again, didn't argue or demand answers. Instead, I watched, listened. Late at night, when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her giggling on the phone, her voice low and conspiratorial. She was careful not to leave any obvious evidence, but I didn't need much to confirm what I already knew. One evening, when she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter, I seized the opportunity. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Emails, messages, small fragments of her double life. I didn't read them all. The bits I did see were enough to make my stomach turn. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing. Love you." The words burned themselves into my brain, but I didn't let the anger take over. I took screenshots, saved the files, and emailed them to myself. Evidence, a lifeline for when the storm finally hit. As I closed the laptop, I glanced up and saw my reflection in the window. I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. Hard, cold, calculating. It scared me, but it also made me feel stronger. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was taking control. That night, as Amelia slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind was no longer clouded by anger or betrayal. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about freedom. The days that followed were a quiet storm. On the surface, everything looked the same. I went to work, Amelia continued her routines, and we spoke only when necessary. But beneath the calm exterior, I was building my escape. I started moving things, small things, out of the house. Personal documents, sentimental items, anything I didn't want caught in the chaos. I took them to a storage unit I rented under a name Amelia wouldn't recognize. It was like constructing a lifeboat while pretending to enjoy the cruise. At night, I'd lie awake, her words from the balcony replaying in my mind. The way she'd laughed at me, mocked me, turned me into some kind of joke to her lover. It wasn't just betrayal, it was contempt, and yet I stayed quiet. I knew if I tipped my hand too early, she'd weaponize it against me. She was good at that, twisting the truth until it broke. One evening, I came home to find her in the living room, sprawled across the couch with a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said, her tone light but probing. "What's going on?" I shrugged, forcing a small smile. "Work's been busy. You know how it is." She studied me for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Well, don't let it get to you. You've been tense." The irony was almost laughable. Tense? Of course I was tense. I was living with a stranger who wore my wife's face, plotting an exit she didn't even see coming. But I swallowed my frustration and nodded. "I'll try to relax," I said, heading to the kitchen before she could ask any more questions. But it wasn't long before her behavior started to shift. She was careful. She always was, but I could tell she was becoming suspicious. She started asking more questions, testing the waters to see if I caught on. "You've been working late a lot," she said one night as we ate dinner. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Big project coming up." She nodded but didn't press further. Still, I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of doubt, the faint shadow of paranoia. She didn't know what I knew, but she could sense something was off. The real turning point came a week later, when I overheard her on the phone again. This time, she wasn't laughing. Her voice was sharp, anxious. "I don't know," she was saying. "He's been weird lately. Distant. I think he knows something." There was a pause, followed by a low murmur I couldn't make out. Her response sent a chill down my spine. "Well, if he does, I'll handle it. He's too spineless to do anything drastic." Spineless. That word echoed in my mind long after she ended the call. It wasn't just an insult. It was a challenge. She thought she knew me, thought I'd roll over and let her walk away unscathed. But she was wrong. That night, as I sat alone in the spare bedroom I'd claimed as my refuge, I realized something important. I didn't just want out of this marriage. I wanted to take back my dignity, my sense of self. For too long, I had let her define me. Her words, her actions, her betrayals. No more. The next morning, I called Tim again. "I'm ready," I told him. "Let's get this started." With Tim's guidance, I began laying the groundwork for the divorce. It was like moving pieces on a chessboard, each step deliberate and calculated. I documented everything. The screenshots, the overheard conversations, the subtle shifts in her demeanor. I knew I had to stay one step ahead of her, especially now that she suspected something was wrong. But Amelia, true to form, wasn't about to let anything slip from her control. Her behavior grew erratic. Some days, she was overly sweet, trying to reel me back in with forced affection and thinly veiled attempts to gauge my mood. Other days, she was cold, distant, her words laced with the venom she usually reserved for those who crossed her. One evening, after yet another tense dinner, she cornered me in the kitchen. "You've been acting strange," she said, her arms crossed. "If there's something going on, just say it." I turned to her, forcing a calm expression. "I don't know what you mean. I've just been busy." Her eyes narrowed. "Busy with what?" "You come home late, you barely talk to me, and you don't even seem like yourself anymore." "Are you hiding something, Mark?" The irony was almost too much. I wanted to laugh, to throw her accusations back in her face, but I held my ground. "I'm not hiding anything," I said evenly. "But maybe you're projecting." That caught her off guard. For a split second, her mask slipped, and I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. But she recovered quickly, her lips curling into a bitter smile. Projecting? That's rich, she said. You know, for someone who claims to be so trustworthy, you've been awfully secretive. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I shrugged and walked past her, leaving her standing there, fuming. Every interaction with her felt like a minefield, but I refused to let her draw me into a fight I couldn't win. The next day, I made my first major move. I opened a separate bank account and transferred half of our joint savings into it. It wasn't much, just enough to cover legal fees and a few months of living expenses, but it felt like reclaiming a part of myself. Tim assured me it was a smart move, especially given Amelia's tendency to manipulate. That evening, Amelia seemed unusually upbeat. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch, smiling at me like nothing was wrong. It was unsettling, to say the least. "Guess what?" she said, her tone light and almost playful. "What?" I asked cautiously. "I booked us a weekend getaway. Just the two of us. I figured we could use some time to reconnect." I stared at her, trying to gauge her intentions. Was this a genuine attempt to salvage our marriage, or another one of her games? Either way, I knew better than to fall for it. "That's thoughtful," I said carefully, "but I don't think I can take time off work right now." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I thought she might push the issue. Instead, she sighed dramatically and took a sip of her wine. "Of course you can't. Work always comes first, doesn't it?" The accusation hung in the air, but I didn't rise to it. I simply nodded and left the room, my mind already racing with plans. Her sudden generosity wasn't a coincidence. She was testing me, trying to figure out how much I knew, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. As I lay in bed that night, I realized something else. The game she was playing, the manipulations and mind games, were starting to backfire. Every move she made only strengthened my resolve to leave. And when the time came, I wouldn't just walk away. I'd do it on my terms with my dignity intact. Amelia's efforts to patch things up or control the narrative only made me more determined. The getaway plan fell through when I feigned an impromptu work obligation, and though she pretended to be disappointed, I could see the frustration boiling beneath the surface. Meanwhile, I continued to gather evidence and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. It wasn't easy, living under the same roof while quietly dismantling the life we'd built together. Every glance, every forced smile, felt like a performance in a play I wanted no part of. But I knew the end was coming, and the thought of freedom kept me going. One night, Amelia's phone buzzed on the counter while she was in the shower. I hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. She'd locked it, of course, but a preview of the message was visible on the screen. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Miss you." My blood ran cold. Tomorrow. She had plans with him, and she didn't even bother to hide it anymore. Or maybe she thought I was too oblivious to notice. Either way, it was the opening I needed. The next morning, I left for work early, but instead of heading to the office, I parked down the street and waited. Sure enough, around 10 a.m., Amelia emerged from the house, dressed to the nines. She climbed in her car and drove off, and I followed at a safe distance. My heart pounded as I tailed her through the city, adrenaline and dread warring in my chest. She pulled into the parking lot of a cozy little cafe on the edge of town. I parked a block away and watched as she greeted a man with a hug that lingered too long. They sat at a corner table, their heads close together, laughing and whispering like teenagers. I snapped a few photos from a distance, my hands trembling as I held the camera. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel. But this was my life, my marriage, and I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story. When I returned home that evening, I was calm, almost eerily so. Amelia was already there, lounging on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. She looked up as I walked in, a hint of surprise flickering across her face. "You're home early," she said, her tone light but wary. "Yeah," I replied, setting my bag down. "Had a change of plans?" She watched me carefully, her eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher my mood. "Everything okay?" I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. "Oh, everything's fine. Just fine." Her unease was palpable, and for a moment, I thought she might confess. But true to form, she deflected. Good, she said, forcing a smile of her own. I made lasagna. Thought we could have a nice dinner together. I nodded, playing along for now. But as I sat across from her at the table, listening to her chatter about mundane things, I felt a strange sense of detachment. She was already gone, and so was I. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I had the evidence I needed. The next move was mine to make. The next morning I called Tim. I have the proof, I told him. My voice was steady, but I could feel the tremor beneath it, the weight of what was about to happen. Good, he said, his tone clinical. Now it's time to act. Are you ready? I paused, glancing around the quiet house. Amelia was in the shower, humming to herself like she didn't have a care in the world. I took a deep breath. I'm ready. The first step was filing the divorce papers, which Tim assured me would be discreet for now. I didn't want her to see it coming, not until I was in a position to control the fallout. While Tim worked on the paperwork, I started putting my personal affairs in order. I closed our joint credit cards, opened new ones in my name, and rerouted my paychecks to my separate account. Every move felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming my life. That evening, Amelia was in an unusually good mood. She poured us both glasses of wine and suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in months. It felt like a trap, but I played along, nodding and smiling as if nothing was wrong. As the credits rolled, she turned to me, her expression softening. I know things have been tense lately, she said, but I want us to work on it. I really do. It was almost laughable, the sheer audacity of her words after everything she'd done. But I bit my tongue, knowing that confrontation now would only derail my plans. Me too, I said simply, raising my glass. It wasn't a lie. I didn't want to work on it, just not with her. I wanted to work on building the life I deserved, free from her deceit and manipulation. Over the next few days, I continued to gather evidence. Every text, every phone call, every suspicious absence was documented. I even installed a small camera in the living room, hidden among the books on the shelf. It felt invasive, but Tim had assured me it was legal in our state, as long as it was in my own home. And it didn't take long for the camera to pay off. One afternoon, while I was at work, Amelia brought him to the house. I watched the footage later that evening, my stomach churning as I saw them together, laughing, touching, kissing in a space we'd once shared as husband and wife. It was a final confirmation, a nail in the coffin of any lingering doubt. But it was her words that stuck with me the most. He doesn't suspect a thing, she said, her voice dripping with confidence. He's so predictable. Predictable. That word echoed in my mind as I sat there, staring at the screen. She thought she'd outsmarted me, that I was too blind, too weak to see the truth. But she was wrong. The next morning I called Tim again. It's time, I said. The next step wasn't easy, but it was necessary. With the evidence I had gathered, Tim filed the divorce papers and began drafting the formal separation agreement. The weight of the decision settled heavily on me, but it also came with a strange sense of liberation. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was choosing. On the surface, things between Amelia and me remained eerily normal. She continued her act of playing the attentive wife, cooking dinner, asking about my day, even suggesting we plan a weekend hike. But I could feel the tension building beneath the surface. She was watching me as closely as I was watching her, trying to gauge whether her carefully constructed facade was still intact. She had no idea I was about to shatter it. The day I handed her the papers was surreal. I came home early, armed with copies of the documents and a determination I hadn't felt in years. Amelia was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine at her side. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're home early," she said, her tone cautious. "I needed to talk to you." I replied, my voice steady. She set her phone down, studying me with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "What's going on?" I pulled the envelope from my bag and set it on the counter between us. "These are divorce papers," I said simply. Her reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a burst of nervous laughter. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "It's not." Her face twisted, the laughter giving way to anger. "You can't be serious," she snapped. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I felt a flicker of anger, but quickly pushed it aside. "This isn't about repayment," I said. "It's about respect and trust. Two things you decided didn't matter when you started seeing him." Her expression shifted, panic flashing across her face before she masked it with indignation. "I don't know what you're talking about." I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder containing the evidence. Photos, screenshots, timestamps. I slid it across the counter, watching as her confidence crumbled with every page she flipped through. This is insane," she stammered, her voice rising. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been protecting myself," I corrected, "because clearly I can't trust you to tell the truth." She threw the papers onto the counter, her face a mix of fury and desperation. "You're being ridiculous. Do you really want to throw our marriage away over this?" "You already threw it away," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm just making it official." For a moment, she was silent, her chest rising and falling as she tried to compose herself. Then, her expression hardened. "Fine," she spat. "If that's how you want to play it, go ahead. But don't think for a second that I'm going to make this easy for you." I nodded, already expecting the fight she was promising. "That's your choice," I said. "But the papers are filed, and there's no turning back." As I left the kitchen, her voice followed me, shouting, cursing, throwing every insult she could think of. But I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally moving forward. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind. Amelia oscillated between cold silence and explosive outbursts, her emotions swinging wildly as she processed the reality of what was happening. I braced myself for the chaos, knowing she'd try to claw back control in any way she could. She didn't disappoint. The first sign came 2 days after I served her the papers. I arrived home from work to find her sitting at the dining table, her arms crossed and a smug expression plastered on her face. On the table was my laptop, its screen open to a shared financial statement. "So," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "care to explain why half our savings mysteriously disappeared?" I kept my expression neutral, refusing to rise to the bait. "I moved it to a separate account," I said simply. "It's standard in these situations." "Standard?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You stole from me." "It's not stealing," I said evenly. "It's protecting my share of the assets." "Tim, my lawyer, said this was the right move." Her eyes narrowed at the mention of my lawyer. "You're such a coward, Mark, hiding behind lawyers and paperwork instead of talking to me like an adult." "Talking?" I shot back, finally letting some of my frustration seep into my voice. "The time for talking ended the moment you started sneaking around behind my back." She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, her lips pressing into a thin line. For once, she had nothing to say. That night, I slept in the spare bedroom again, the distance between us now more than just physical. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we'd ever gotten to this point. But no matter how many times I turned it over in my mind, the answer was always the same. It wasn't just one moment, one choice. It was years of erosion, of lies and betrayal chipping away at the foundation of our marriage until there was nothing left to salvage. The next few days were quieter, though the tension was palpable. Amelia stopped trying to engage me, instead retreating into her own world of whispered phone calls and late-night texting. I knew she was plotting something. She always was, but I refused to let her paranoia infect me. I had my own plans to focus on. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest updates from Tim, Amelia barged into the room, her face flushed with anger. "I want the house," she declared, her voice sharp and unyielding. "If you're so desperate to leave, then leave. But I'm not giving this up." I glanced at her, keeping my expression calm. The house is a joint asset, I said. It'll be decided during the settlement. She let out a bitter laugh. You really think you're going to get a fair deal? After everything you've done? It was almost laughable, the sheer audacity of her victim act. But I didn't take the bait. We'll see what the courts decide, I said, turning back to my papers. Her laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an icy glare. You're going to regret this, Mark. I'll make sure of it. I didn't respond. Her threats didn't scare me anymore. If anything, they only solidified my resolve to see this through. As she stormed out of the room, I let out a slow breath, the tension in my chest easing slightly. The fallout was only beginning, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. The next week felt like living in a pressure cooker. Amelia's rage simmered beneath the surface, boiling over at unexpected moments. She began leaving for long stretches during the day, returning late at night without a word of explanation. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Every time she walked through the door, the smell of someone else's cologne hung faintly in the air. But her behavior wasn't just erratic, it was strategic. Amelia started going out of her way to paint herself as the wrong party. She suddenly became overly social, inviting mutual friends over for coffee or drinks, making sure to emphasize how hard things were for her. One evening, I walked into the living room to find her sitting with two of our friends, a carefully placed tissue in her hand as she dabbed at imaginary tears. It's just been so difficult, she was saying, her voice trembling in a way I knew was calculated. Mark's been so distant. I don't know what I did wrong. They turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of sympathy and confusion. I felt a spark of anger, but forced myself to remain calm. Can I talk to you for a moment? I asked, keeping my tone polite but firm. Amelia's lips twitched into a smug smile as she stood. Of course, she said, following me into the kitchen. What are you doing? I asked once we were out of earshot. She crossed her arms, her expression shifting to feigned innocence. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean, I said, my voice low. Stop dragging other people into this. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw the mask slip. What's the matter, Mark? Afraid people will start to see the truth? I stared at her, the weight of her manipulations pressing down on me. The truth will come out, I said finally. You might want to think about which side of it you want to be on. She didn't respond, just smiled that cold, calculating smile before turning and walking back into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the counter as I tried to steady my breathing. The next day, I called Tim to update him on the situation. She's trying to spin the narrative, I said. She's already got some of our friends believing she's the victim. That's not unusual, he replied. People like her thrive on control, and when they start losing it, they'll do anything to get it back. Just stay focused on the facts. The evidence you've gathered will speak for itself. His words gave me some comfort, but they didn't erase the growing tension. Every day felt like a battle, and I was tired of fighting, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. Later that week, Amelia made her boldest move yet. I came home from work to find a police officer standing on the front porch. My stomach dropped as I approached, wondering what fresh hell she'd concocted. Mr. Langston? The officer asked, glancing at his clipboard. Yes, I said cautiously. What's going on? We received a call from your wife, he said, his tone neutral. She reported feeling unsafe and asked us to check on the situation. I blinked, stunned by the audacity. Unsafe? I repeated. I've done nothing. The officer held up a hand. I'm just here to make sure everything's okay. Mind if I come in and ask a few questions? Amelia appeared in the doorway, her face a perfect mask of concern. Oh, officer, thank you so much for coming, she said, her voice trembling. I've just been so scared lately. Mark's been acting different. It took every ounce of self-control not to explode. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm as the officer asked his questions. I answered honestly, knowing I had nothing to hide. After a thorough and, thankfully, professional discussion, the officer left, his demeanor suggesting he wasn't entirely convinced by Amelia's performance. But the damage had been done. She planted the seed of doubt, and she knew it. As I closed the door behind him, I turned to her, my voice ice cold. "Is this your plan? To paint me as the villain?" She shrugged, her lips curving into a smirk. "It's not my fault if people believe what they see." I stared at her, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a failing marriage. This was war. The encounter with the police was a wake-up call. Amelia wasn't just playing mind games anymore. She was escalating, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Her smirk after the officer left made it clear she wouldn't stop until she dragged me down with her. The next morning, I called Tim again. "She's trying to build a case against me," I told him, relaying the incident. "She called the police and made it seem like I'm some kind of threat." Tim's voice was calm, but firm. "This is classic manipulation, Mark. She's laying the groundwork for a false narrative. The good news is, you've been documenting everything, right?" "Everything," I confirmed. "But what do I do now?" "Stay calm," he said. "Don't engage with her provocations, no matter how tempting it might be. Install security cameras in your home, especially in shared spaces. Make sure there's a record of everything. This will protect you from false claims." The thought of cameras in my house felt invasive, but I knew it was necessary. By that evening, I had installed discrete cameras in the living room, kitchen, and hallway. If Amelia wanted to play dirty, I wasn't going to leave myself vulnerable. The following days were a test of patience. Amelia alternated between hostility and performative vulnerability, her actions designed to provoke a reaction. She'd leave messes in the kitchen and accuse me of being controlling when I asked her to clean up. She'd stay out late, coming home drunk and slamming doors, then claim the next morning that my anger made her feel unsafe. I refused to take the bait. Every word, every action I documented, knowing it could become vital in the courtroom. One evening, as I reviewed the footage from the cameras, I caught her on the phone again. Her voice was low, conspiratorial. "He's setting me up," she said. "I know it. He's been too quiet, too calculated. But don't worry. I'll make sure the judge sees who he really is." Her lover's voice was faint but audible. "Do you think he'll fight for the house?" "Probably," she said, laughing bitterly. "But it doesn't matter. I'll spin this so hard he won't know what hit him." The coldness of her words stung, but it also strengthened my resolve. She wasn't just trying to escape the marriage. She wanted to destroy me in the process. But she underestimated me. For years, I had been the quiet, accommodating husband, letting her control the narrative. Not anymore. The next morning, I met with Tim in person to strategize. "She's going to try to smear me," I told him. "I heard her talking about it. What can we do?" Tim leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "We're already a step ahead. The evidence you've gathered is solid, and the cameras will back you up if she makes false claims. We'll file for temporary orders to protect your assets and ensure you have access to the house. Let her throw her accusations. She won't have anything to back them up." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just reacting. I was fighting back. Later that evening, Amelia confronted me again. She stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, her arms crossed. "So, are we just going to keep pretending everything's fine?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I'm not pretending," I said calmly. "I'm done pretending." Her eyes narrowed. "You really think you're going to come out of this unscathed?" "I think the truth will come out," I said, meeting her gaze. "And I'm ready for it." Her expression faltered, just for a moment, before she turned and walked away. I closed the door, my heart pounding, but my resolve unshaken. This wasn't just about leaving her anymore. It was about reclaiming myself, no matter what it took. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, tense standoffs, and carefully controlled chaos. Amelia's antics escalated as the reality of the divorce sank in. She started playing to an audience, posting cryptic, pity-seeking messages on social media, sharing pictures of herself looking forlorn with captions like, "When you try your best, but it's never enough." I didn't respond. Let her have her performance. I was playing the long game. The day of our first court hearing arrived faster than I expected. It wasn't the final trial. Just a preliminary session to determine temporary orders regarding our assets and living arrangements. I walked into the courthouse armed with Tim, my documentation, and the calm resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. Amelia, of course, arrived in dramatic fashion. She wore a somber expression, her eyes darting around as if she wanted to ensure everyone noticed her pain. Her lawyer, a sharp-looking man with an air of calculated arrogance, stood by her side. The hearing began, and her lawyer wasted no time painting me as the villain. He spoke of her emotional suffering, her fear for her safety, and the hostile environment I had supposedly created in our home. Amelia nodded along, even dabbing at her eyes with a tissue for added effect. When it was my turn, Tim calmly presented the evidence. He played snippets of the audio and video footage, showing her late-night rendezvous, her mocking phone calls, and even her staged attempts to provoke me. The judge's expression shifted as the truth came into focus. By the time Tim finished, the room was silent except for the sound of Amelia shifting uncomfortably in her chair. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. "Your Honor," Tim said, "it's clear that my client has acted in good faith throughout this process. He's gathered indisputable evidence of infidelity and manipulative behavior. We request that he retain access to the marital home and that the court consider the emotional and financial toll this situation has taken on him." The judge nodded thoughtfully, her gaze shifting to Amelia. "Mrs. Langston, do you have anything to say in response to this evidence?" Amelia hesitated, her carefully constructed mask slipping. This isn't fair," she stammered. "He's been spying on me, invading my privacy. Your behavior in your own home is not protected from documentation," the judge interrupted firmly. "And based on what I've seen, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Langston's counsel. Temporary possession of the home is granted to him until this matter is resolved." The gavel struck, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. Amelia's face was a mix of shock and fury, but she said nothing as we exited the courtroom. I could feel her eyes burning into my back as Tim and I walked away. Later that evening, as I sat alone in what now felt like my home again, I let out a long breath. It wasn't over yet. There were still settlements to negotiate, final hearings to attend, but I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The next morning, I woke to a message from Amelia. It was short, bitter, and dripping with venom. "You'll regret this." But I didn't regret it, not for a second, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't living for her approval, her games, or her lies. I was living for myself, and that's how I left her and the toxic life she built behind. If anyone out there is going through something similar, know this: you're stronger than you think. You deserve better, and you can rebuild, one step at a time,